What's your first memory? Like if I were to say, think back to when you were a kid, what's the first thing that you remember? For me, I'm 2 years old and I'm laying in a bed that feels very big and like 1,000 feet tall. And it's sort of surrounded by like silver metal. And off to the side are both my mom and my dad, and they're looking at me, and I can tell they're trying to be reassuring, but I also feel like they're a bit nervous. And I'm laying in this bed, feeling scared and confused and not quite sure why I'm here and what's about to happen. And there's this giant like circular light above me that feels like it's like shining right on me like a spotlight. And then all of a sudden, this person walks out in what looks like to me like blue pajamas, and they're wearing like this little hat and they've got this mask on. And for some reason they know my name, which feels confusing. And then they say, "Can you count to 10?" I think I got to number 2, and then I just lost time. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, time comes rushing back, and I'm feeling tired and confused, not sure where I am. As I look down, I notice part of my legs are gone, and there's just bandages there. That's my first memory. Today, I'm gonna answer the question that I get asked most often, either in person or online. Where are my legs? I entered the world on January 7th, 1981, around 7 a.m. in Rock Springs, Wyoming in the United States, to 2 loving parents, Tonette and Kenny. Now, as it's been told to me by my aunt, who was in high school at the time, she and my mom's parents and other family members were in the hospital waiting room, very excited because I was going to be the first grandchild on my mother's side of the family. My aunt said the doors open and someone, a nurse or maybe a doctor, said, "We have a baby." And everyone was very excited. Now, I was born via cesarean because I was breech. And from the minute I entered the world, it was very clear that something wasn't quite right. My legs didn't look like they were supposed to. Something looked different. And as it's been described to me, they looked sort of like little frog legs. And they noticed not too long after that one of my legs was also broken. A few weeks after that, they discovered that I was born with a genetic disease called sacraligenesis, which basically means the sacrum, which is that piece sort of between like your pelvis and your spine, didn't form correctly. Yes, that's a piece of lint on my shirt, it's fine. Now there's varying degrees of this disease, but for me in particular, it affected the muscles in my legs and it also affected my bladder. So what that means is I wasn't really able to move my legs. I could feel them, but I couldn't do much with them. They sort of just dragged behind me. And I don't really remember much about my legs other than I hated having my toenails clipped. Because this was such a rare disease and they didn't know what to do with it in the part of the country where I was living, and my parents were ready to have a child, but they weren't ready to have a child with a disability that was gonna need some intense surgeries, they found the Shriners. And there was a Shriners Hospital 2.5 hours away in Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, to tell the rest of the story, I'm gonna need some visual aids. As I mentioned earlier, my first surgery was at the age of 2, where they amputated my legs at the knee in hopes that I could use prosthetic legs, because the idea was that I would have enough use of my legs and muscle use that they could attach prosthetics just below where my knee was, and I could walk around that way. But that didn't work out. So then, when I was 5 years old, I went back into the hospital and they amputated them just below my pelvis. With this second surgery, because I was 5 years old, I was more cognitively aware of what was about to happen. And remembering my first surgery, I knew that it was going to be difficult and scary, because one of the things that you may not know is in the 1980s, your parents couldn't stay the night with you at the hospital. They had to leave at the end of the night, and then they couldn't come back until the next morning when visiting hours resumed. So I knew that I was going to have to lay in a bed in a giant room with other sick kids and cry myself to sleep. However, what I also remembered is you get a lot of gifts when you have surgery as a kid. So I thought, well, that's gonna be kind of cool. And I'll never forget, the 2 big gifts that I got was I was into Jem and the Holograms, an incredible 1980s cartoon. You definitely need to go check it out. I got the Jem doll, the Jerrica that turns into Jem and her earrings like lit up. I also got a Teddy Ruxpin. And for those of you that aren't familiar, a Teddy Ruxpin was this giant teddy bear, and on the back, you would open up its back and there was a cassette player and you would put in a little tape And then when you push play, it was like a little robot, and this Teddy Ruxpin would tell you stories. His little mouth would move, and he was like a little stereo, and he would tell you stories. It was like the hottest toy at the time. Those are the two things that I got, and that's actually what I remember from that surgery. Now, before we go any further, a quick anatomy lesson. Remember I said my legs were amputated just below my pelvis, which means I still have my cash and prizes. Now, on one hand, things got so much easier for me because I was no longer having these legs drag behind me and get all scraped up as I was trying to crawl around. I could now stand up on my hands and walk upright, which was so much easier to get around. On the other hand, things got a little bit more challenging. And what I mean by that is every couple of months, we would have to go back to the Shriners Hospital for a checkup. And not only was the car ride really long, and as a 5-year-old, it felt like forever, then we'd have to get up really early and sit in this waiting room what felt like hours upon hours upon hours. And then we would finally get called into the room, and it was this giant room that sort of felt like American Idol, but a much scarier version, meaning at the front of the room was this large, long table, and behind the table were 2 doctors and then a nurse. So it sort of felt like, Paula, Randy, and Simon. I wish it was them and not these people, truthfully. And then this panel would ask you a bunch of questions, how things are going, and then they would physically examine your body. So I used to have to get completely naked so they could look at my body, which always felt uncomfortable. And truthfully, I don't remember if consent was ever asked. And then I'll never forget, on one of the visits, one of the doctors said, well, every kid wants to walk, so we think you should try prosthetic legs. And even at 5 years old, I remember thinking, but I already walk. I can walk on my hands. Why do I need prosthetic legs? But we went with what the doctor said, and so we got some prosthetic legs, and they were so difficult to use. Now, I would use them twice a week in elementary school. I had like a teacher's aide, and then I had a physical therapist that I would meet with, and I would practice walking in the halls. And it was basically this bucket that they had molded around my body. Once again, I had to get naked for a stranger. And it sat on top of these legs, and I had to learn to use crutches and shift my weight and throw the leg up as I walked. They were so difficult to use, and it was so confusing to me. Even at 5 years old, I was like, people know that I don't have legs, and I know that I don't have legs, so why would I pretend like I do? Now, let me be very clear. Prosthetics can be very helpful for a lot of disabled folks, but for me, they were very difficult to use, and it was so much easier for me to walk around on my hands. So, in grade 2, we ditched the prosthetic legs, and I got a wheelchair instead. Which means, since grade 2 up until present day, I navigate the world walking on my hands, using a wheelchair. And I found some other creative ways to get around. I would use a skateboard. I had an electric car and a Jeep that I could drive with my hands. I tried roller skates on my hands. When I was old enough, I drove my dad's 4-wheeler. Relax, I'm just posing for a photo. That's why I'm not wearing a helmet. And when I was 16, I learned how to drive a car with hand controls. Woo, we went on a journey today. We started out with what's your first memory and ended up with my entire story about how I acquired my disability and how I navigate the world, which I think is really important, and I wanted to share with all of you, especially because there's so many new subscribers, and I'm so grateful that you're here. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of sort of how I came to be. And I want to spend the next year storytelling with you. It's something that I'm so passionate about and I love to do. And I want to share more stories from my life, from other people's lives. I'll show you some experiences that I'm going to have over the next year. I'm writing a book, and I'm hoping to give you a little behind the scenes every now and then of that. But at the end of the day, I hope you come back every Friday to hear a new story and to experience a part of my life as I tell that story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. You know all the things. Hit the bell to get the notifications. And I hope to see you again next Friday. Thanks for tuning in. I really, really do appreciate it. Okay, bye.